Well, go ahead and be seated. Good morning. Jesus Christ is risen indeed. And I want to welcome you to church this morning. My name is Jeff. I'm one of the pastors here. And what a blessing to have you this morning. If you're here for the very first time, we are indeed grateful that you have chosen to be with us today. And we're just delighted to have you. The theme this morning, and you've probably already figured it out, it's in a single word, and that word is light. The resurrected Jesus Christ is indeed the light of the world. And I want to share with you just a few thoughts from the first chapter of the Gospel of John. We heard some of the words from that chapter as we opened this morning. So if you've got your Bible, you might open it and follow along with me in John, beginning in the very first verse. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by Him, and without Him was not anything made that was made. I think those words are probably among the most eloquent words in the Bible. It is certainly a beautiful and a biblical way to introduce the story of Jesus. But you need to know that Jewish readers reading these words would see nothing new here. Now, by the time John wrote this gospel, more Gentile believers of Jesus existed than Jewish believers, but still, this was not new information. In fact, when John opens by saying, "in the beginning," he makes a very deliberate, intentional connection with the very first verse in the Bible, Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created. And even the concept of God, the Creator God, the only God, the one true God, all-powerful, is certainly nothing new for the Jewish people. By the time Jesus came along, the Hebrew Scriptures had been translated into Aramaic, which was the language that most Jewish people would speak in their homes. In fact, the most common everyday language in the area where Jesus was raised, where all of the events of the gospel take place. And when they translated the concept of God revealing Himself to mankind as the Word choice in Aramaic was memra. And I say that because to this day, Jewish people speak of the memra, God revealing Himself in ways that we as human beings can understand. And so this was nothing new for John to say in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. What was the theological bombshell is what John says in verse 14, if you might drop down there with me. And the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. And we beheld His glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. Now this would have been staggering to everybody. To think that God Almighty would choose to become one of us in the form of Jesus of Nazareth. I mean, how could that possibly be? What in the world is going on with that? Maybe you're one of those people this morning that has a real hard time conceiving a personal God who truly does love us, who truly does want to interact in our lives and give us purpose and meaning. But that is exactly what John is implying here. And by the way, as I said a moment ago, I really do believe that Jesus came out of that tomb on the third day, that first Easter 2,000 years ago. That is the very essence of our faith. It's our reason for being here. If that's not true, then we have no hope, and we really have no meaning beyond what we can see. John went on, he said in verse 4, in Him was life, and the life was the light of men. Now, even that ties back to the book of Genesis, because the very first thing that God did in creation was to separate light and darkness. And what Jesus Christ has done is exactly the same thing. In our lives, He is the one that separates darkness and light. And John says, in Him was life, and this life is the light of every one of us in life. Verse 5, the light shines in darkness, and the darkness comprehends it not. In the Greek language in which John is writing, the verb shines is continual present tense. In other words, what John is saying here, the light has never stopped shining. It shines on and on and on. It has always been shining from the very beginning. And then he says in verse 6, there was a man sent from God whose name was John. Now, this is not the John that wrote the gospel that we're reading. This was John the Baptizer, as we often call him. The same came for a witness, to bear witness of the light, that all men through him might believe. He was not that light, but was sent to bear witness of that light. That was the true light, which lights every man that comes into the world. And so right here in John chapter 1, we have this amazing imagery of light and darkness. And I suppose there is no greater stage for that light and darkness than what we celebrate on Easter morning, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. I can't even begin to imagine the darkness that his followers must have felt as he was delivered to be crucified. For the last 3 years, they have followed this man. They have put their faith in him as the one that the prophets had promised. The promised Messiah, the Christ, the one for which they had been waiting. And as they have followed him for all of this time and been with him under so many different circumstances, they have absolutely been left with their mouths open as they think about God with us. And suddenly it begins to sink into them that what Jesus has been telling them is true. He's going to be taken from them. He's going to be crucified. He is willingly, intentionally, knowingly, lovingly going to allow himself to be crucified in order to be the light. But I can't imagine the darkness they must have experienced as they saw him taken away to judgment, as they saw him hanging on a cross. In fact, even in a physical sense, the Bible speaks of this great darkness that came upon the earth, literally, figuratively, in every way. But at the same time, it's hard to imagine the contrast that first Easter Sunday morning as the women came at dawn to the tomb, thinking that they were going to anoint his body according to Jewish custom. And when they arrive, they find that the tomb is empty. Just as dark as the darkness had been, the light now is incomprehensible. You know, some writers state their purpose at the very beginning. John is one of those writers that states his purpose at the end. And at the very end of his gospel in chapter 20, John said, you know, I have chosen these things to write about Jesus, that believing you might have life through his name. And that's the whole purpose of this. Jesus said that he had come not just that we might have life in heaven, and sometimes we reduce the Christian faith just as a way to get human beings from earth to heaven when they die. Well, that's certainly important. But Jesus said, no, I'm talking about life. He said in John 10, I've come that you might have life and that you might have it more abundantly. Because that life is our light. And even in the darkest moments of life, it is the light of Jesus Christ that illuminates our way, that gives us the ability and the wisdom to be able to respond to the unexpected turns of life and sometimes the evil things that happen in this world because we live in a world that is filled with sin. Verse 10 of John 1 says, he was in the world, and the world was made by him, and the world knew him not. He came unto his own, and his own received him not. But as many as received him, to them gave he power to become the sons of God, even to them that believe on his name. The week before last, I was in Lima, Peru. I was speaking to a group of 3,000 pastors and leaders at a large conference of a large group of churches in Peru. We were in an auditorium that would be roughly 3 times the size of this one this morning. It was packed out. People were just everywhere. It was a great time. We'd had this great celebration, and it was my turn to preach, and I got up to preach, and massive place, 2 different balconies and 2 different levels to the platform. It's a pretty impressive looking place, and so I'm up doing my thing and going through this sermon, and I'm about 1/3 of the way into the sermon when something totally unexpected happened. And what happened was something just like this. All the lights went off, but I said, don't worry, don't panic, just stay right where you are, because I know how to talk very loudly. I used to pastor in a war zone. We used to have the lights go off all the time. You're not used to it here, but I am. So just continue listening to what I'm going to say. And so I lifted my voice as much as I possibly could. It was amazing how quiet it became. I suddenly became aware that people were listening more intensely than they would have if I had a microphone and lights. Now, I was confused because I couldn't even see my notes. I had no idea what was going on. I noticed that there was activity on the platform around me, but we couldn't see clearly. And then I suddenly realized that somebody was bringing me a megaphone. And so I got a megaphone. They handed this to me, and I'm still trying to figure out what in the world I'm talking about. And so all of a sudden, I'm using the megaphone because they didn't think that I could reach the upper balcony, but we found out later that I could. And so here I am preaching like this with a microphone, and the guys are scrambling. They're trying to turn on the emergency power, but even once you do that, it takes a while to get the electronic equipment up. And when they did, they had a microphone that was ready for me. So all of a sudden, with all this activity going on around the stage, I take the megaphone, I grab a handheld microphone, and off we go. I still didn't have any light on the platform, so I'm just making this up as we go. God only knows what I said. I hope it was good. But I think that when it was all over, they would say, what did the guy say? I don't know. He just kept talking. It was awesome. He just kept talking. What did he say? I have no idea, but he just kept going and going and going. And then after a while, the lights very slowly began to come back on. They had got the emergency power up. And after about 15 minutes of this, literally, all of a sudden, we realized the lights were on. Now, it was kind of weird because I had a death grip on this handheld microphone. That was my lifeline. And they came up and actually had to pry it out of my little hands here. They said, hey, your lapel mic is working. And so we were able to do that and get back into it. But it was amazing because that night and later the next day, the people who were there, as they talked about it, they said, you know, what a powerful analogy that was. Here we were just very comfortable, going to church like normal, and all of a sudden the lights were off, not just in the church, they were off in the entire neighborhood. It was pitch black, it was at night, there was no light leaking in. And so it was just that horrible realization that we're in the middle of darkness. And yet they said, here's what was so powerful about it. The word just kept coming. And we felt the security of knowing that the word never stopped. It just kept coming. And then little by little, our eyes began to adjust, and little by little, some of the emergency lights came on, and we could see that there were people on the platform who recognized the problem, and they were working just as hard as they could in order to amplify the sound, to amplify the word. And more as we went through the whole process, it just became evident that, wow, this is going to work. And then after a while, the lights just slowly coming back up, then they were on. The lights came on. And my prayer this morning is that maybe some of you who are here, maybe this would be the day. Maybe it's been kind of a slow process, but maybe this would be the day that the light would come on for you. And that you would realize there is no life, there is no light without Jesus Christ, who is the light of the world. And can I just say this right now, if at any moment you feel a need to talk to somebody about your relationship with God. What does it mean to be a follower of Jesus Christ? That's what this church is about. We're about all of us learning together how we can be genuine followers of Jesus Christ. And if you would like to talk to somebody about what that means, there's an orange and white contact card in the back of a seat near you. And at any moment, just take that out, fill out the contact information. There's an ABCD down at the bottom. You can just circle the C as a sign. Hey, I want somebody to contact me. And we're an international church, and of all the languages in our church, Spanish is by far the most commonly spoken language other than English. Así que al otro lado, al revés, dice lo mismo. Y solamente tienes que hacer un círculo allí donde dice la letra C, and we will contact you as well. And that's what we do. And right outside the door is the VIG little counter there, VIG, very important guest. And if you just drop that off, and by the way, if you haven't visited that yet, do so, and kind of sign in and give you any information that they possibly can about church. And if you would just do that, there'll be no lights and bells and whistles and sirens that go off. It's something that we do every Sunday. And people just say, hey, how can I connect with somebody to learn more about Jesus Christ? But here's the key. And here's why we turned the lights off just a moment ago. Before there can be light in our life, we have to recognize the darkness. And that's what happened to me. That's what's happened to so many people. There are times in life when life can be very dark indeed. But those are the very moments when we recognize how much we need the light. Seemed like the darker my life became, the brighter the light became. And that's the whole point of this that we have. The good news of Jesus Christ is that He is God in human form, willingly, lovingly, intentionally paid the price for our sin through His death on the cross. And when He rose again on the third day, what He was doing is confirming His identity as God in human form. And He was winning victory once and for all over sin and death. I'm not the only one who gets this. I want you to pay attention to the screens right here, if you would. I want you to hear the stories of a few others from church here.
I think the sins that I dealt with the most are sins that I didn't even realize were sins. And for me, I would say that was pride, selfishness, and fear. And I didn't realize it because it was something that I think was internal. And even though it was manifesting outwardly, I didn't know how to get to the root of things. All I knew is what was transpiring outside of me.
There's a story in Mark chapter 9 that ends with a man coming to Jesus, and he asks him, tells him, I believe, help my unbelief. This is me. This was me in high school. This is where I lived, was struggling to believe God.
The weight of sin is most obvious in its consequences. But for me, I was just so prideful. I didn't really see the consequences of my sin until I realized that the person who I wanted to be, I was nowhere close to being. I was much different, and I didn't like who I was. That's a dark place to be. Really what sin boils down to is it's not about the consequence of the degree of it. You experience that. Really, sin is putting yourself in God's place and you being the judge of it instead of Him. But eventually that gets to be too much, and that weight crushes you because you can't even live up to your own expectations. That's a dark place to be. And that is where God's grace shined through. Because all of a sudden, I didn't have to pretend to be anyone in His presence. What I did, I just came to Him as I was. As a fraud, as a hypocrite. And He rescued me there. And that's where the burden lifted. Not because of what I'd done, not because of how I've carried myself, but because He's merciful and His grace is sufficient for all my sin.
And through my journey, I realized that rather than separating God's grace and my suffering, that they were both in the same. That Jesus used my suffering as a means of His grace to accomplish His purposes in everything I do in life.
When God dealt with my pride, selfishness, and fear, He did it through His amazing grace and through His love. And by counteracting everything that I was dealing with, He came in and counteracted pride with humility, counteracted selfishness with selflessness, and counteracted fear with perfect love. And that is where I'm at today, still growing, still developing from that, but just knowing that God's grace is always there, and it's nothing that I can do to deserve it, but it's all about what He's already done.
Well, you've heard some snippets of stories of people who are part of the church here, and I'd like to add a little bit of my own. Earlier, when we were looking at the first chapter of John, we talked about that amazing contrast between darkness and light. And the point is simply this: we don't really recognize our need for the light until we recognize the darkness. And perhaps the hardest thing about that is not recognizing the darkness in the world around us. That's not hard to do at all. The really rough thing is when we begin to recognize the darkness that is within each one of us. And I guess that's where I struggled. And the reason that I struggled with that is because I had a truly unremarkable childhood. I mean, really, I grew up in and out of Sunday school and never got into a lot of trouble. I made it all the way through high school and college, never got arrested, never did anything really bad. I think it would have been easier had I been an axe murderer, a serial killer, or a pimp, or a drug trafficker, or something like that, where I could say, wow, one day Jesus showed up, my whole life is transformed, woo, isn't this great? But it wasn't like that for me. It was very difficult for me to understand that contrast between darkness and light. And I guess what happened in my case is when I went to college, my life became increasingly darker. Not because I did any horrid acts or anything like that. I just began to try to figure out what life was all about. I was studying a lot of philosophy. And as I did, I explored everything from witchcraft to Satanism. Not that I ever really did anything. I was just a curious kid. And the more that I would look, the more that I would explore, it seemed like the more I struggled with doubt. And the more that I struggled with doubt, the darker my life became within. And that's what happened to me. It was really a process. And I realized that no matter how good I was, I would never be good enough. And only then did I begin to really be conscious of the darkness within me. And again, I'd like to tell you that I had some dramatic thing happen to me. You know, I was walking down the street and somebody comes up and starts, shouting at me with a megaphone or something like that, or preaching at me, or read this verse in the Bible, and I read the verse in the Bible and my life was transformed. No, in fact, let me be honest with you, there were people in my life who would try to share the Bible with me. And to be perfectly frank, it turned me off. I didn't like that at all. I wasn't ready for the Bible. I'd been in Sunday school, studied the Bible, and I thought, man, these people they're just so irrelevant. They're just so out of touch, and they're acting like jerks, and I don't want to be any part of that. And so what God used in my life was a novel, a short novel that was written in the late 1800s. I was reading it for a class in philosophy. It was written by Joseph Conrad, and the novel is called The Heart of Darkness. And I will never forget, this wasn't my conversion experience, but it was the first time in my life I really began to understand the darkness within. This short novel is one that explores the relationship between colonialism and racism that made it possible for imperialism. And from his own personal experience, the author, Joseph Conrad, who had spent some time in Africa, tells the story of a man named Marlowe who sails up the Congo River in search of a mysterious Mr. Kurtz. And on this trip, he is drawn into the darkness of the Congo wilderness, but at the same time, he is drawn into the darkness of the way that the Europeans were treating the natives and the unfathomable darkness within every human being for committing heinous acts of evil. And he became totally disgusted by the cruelty, the futility, the lust for ivory at that point in history that was driving people to do unspeakable things. And one evening on the deck of the boat that was taking him down the river, he looks out and he sees a group of cannibals right on the shore beside him. He sees and he hears. And it was a shock to him. And he said, what really shocked me was not that they seemed so inhuman. The shock to me was the fact that they were just as human as I. And he wrote this passage, and I wrote it down. I wanted to share it with you. I'll never forget reading this. He said, well, you know, that was the worst of it. This suspicion of their not being inhuman. It would come slowly to one. They howled and leaped and spun and made horrid faces. But what thrilled you was just the thought of their humanity like yours. The thought of your remote kinship with this wild and passionate uproar. Ugly? Yes, it was justly enough. But if you were man enough, you would admit to yourself that there was in you just the faintest trace of a response to the terrible frankness of that noise. A dim suspicion of there being a meaning in it which you so remote from the night of first ages, could comprehend. As I read that, I was slowly coming to understand that even though I had never done any despicable deeds, I'd never taken an automatic weapon into a cinema or into a grade school, I'd never done anything like that, but I began to realize the same seed of sin resides in me. And even though I had never engaged in my life falling apart in that way, I did come to realize that as good as I had thought that I was, my life was broken and it needed to be fixed. And it was only then when I could begin to understand the darkness within me could I comprehend my need for the light of Jesus Christ. And that's when the light began to shine, kind of like the night in Lima that I was telling you about earlier, dimly at first. But then more and more the light began to shine, and then that's the point when faith became real for me. The night that Jesus was betrayed, Peter denied him 3 times. Peter, his trusted friend, the de facto leader of the 12. But Peter also had to recognize the darkness within him in order to see the brightness of God's light. And once he recognized that, then he was ready to be an agent of transformation that could be used to influence the entire world. The death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ are the heart of our faith, the very essence of our life. And through the centuries, believers from every background, every language and culture have followed the instructions of Jesus Christ that last night when he was betrayed, as he ate the Last Supper with his 12. His instructions to remember and commemorate what he did for us by following the example that he set in that Last Supper. And in just a moment, we're going to do just that. And those of you who are going to serve, I would ask you to prepare for that. But just before we do, and as they come, I just want to encourage you, if you are our guest this morning, I would love to invite you to be here same time next Sunday morning. We are going through a study of the Gospel of Luke. It's fascinating, learning who Jesus Christ really is. Here's what the Apostle Paul said about what is sometimes called communion, or the Lord's Supper, or the Lord's table. He wrote this to the Corinthians. Paul had not been there that night with the 12. Paul was not yet a believer. He wouldn't come to faith until many years later. But talking to those who had been there, even when Paul came to faith, this observance that we're going to partake in had already become central to everything that we are as believers. He wrote to the Corinthians and he said, "For I have received of the Lord that which also I delivered unto you, that the Lord Jesus, the same night in which he was betrayed, took bread. And when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, Take, eat. This is my body, which is broken for you. This do in remembrance of me. After the same manner also he took the cup when he had supped, saying, This cup is the New Testament in my blood. This do as oft as you drink it in remembrance of me." We had a night of praise last night. These 3 crosses were here. And many of you came and symbolically left your burdens at the cross. And so this morning, as we partake in the Lord's Supper, As a way to remind ourselves of what this is all about, we are going to partake of the Lord's Supper at the very place where our burdens are lifted, the cross of Jesus Christ.